Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to listen to this. The narrow-mouthed but broad-minded whorl snail, Vertigo angustior, in Wales. What's happened in the last 40 years? In fact, I'm going to stretch things a bit further than that, because really we're going to go back to 193 years to start this story. So don't mind if we go back a little bit further. Most of the talks concentrated on the last 40-year period, which is where things really started, as you'll see. Right, it's not clicking to the next slide. This thing isn't working. Right, can I do it from this? Right, okay. Vertigo angustior, as many of you will know, is a very tiny snail. It's probably the smallest of the Vertigo species. And to describe in a nutshell the sort of place it lives, I can't find a better tight structure than Michael Kearney came up with in the Atlas in 1999. Restricted to moist places which are affected neither by desiccation nor by flooding. It requires open conditions, quickly warmed by the sun, inhabiting short vegetation of grasses, mosses, or low herbs. So that puts it in a nice, as was Michael Kearney's way, nice tight structure. There's another definition a bit later on that Robert has constructed, which is slightly fuller. Now, Vertigo angustior does live occasionally with other species. The first one, which is often a bad sign, actually, if you find this with Vertigo angustior, it often indicates that the habitat's too wet. In fact, there seems to be a sort of an opposition between these two species. So you do occasionally get them together, but generally, if you get a lot of anti-Vertigo, you start not getting angustior. And in fact, a lot of the sites that we found in the last 2 years don't have anti-Vertigo at all. Another Vertigo you can find with it is Vertigo pygmaea, and this tends to be in conditions perhaps which are a little drier. It's a more common associate with angustior than the other Vertigos, and certainly in Wales, occasionally you get the third Vertigo here, Vertigo substriata. This tends to be in slightly more shaded conditions. In fact, the largest number of substratus I found with angustior was actually in a dune slack, which you'll see in a minute, which was surrounded by pine trees. Right, now there's quite a bit of conservation recognition for this species. It started off in 1991 with a mention in the red data books, where it was assessed as endangered in 1991. The European Union recognized this as an important species, important mollusk, and it appears on the EU Habitat and Species Directive, Annex 2A. Now that fortunately doesn't mean you need a license to collect these and to work on them, but it does mean that countries in the EU with this species there have to designate SACs for it. In fact, one of the sites we'll be talking about today is an SAC for this particular snail. This is the old sort of BAP priority list and evolution of it. It's a Welsh section 42, species of principal importance. And finally, in the most recent status review that was produced by Mary Seddon and others, it was assessed as vulnerable. In fact, since 2014, the loss of some populations or the decline of others in Scotland possibly means that we're beginning to get to review that status. It might be getting towards the endangered position. It's gone in southwest Scotland now because of sea level rise, and quite a lot of the populations in East Anglia are certainly at risk. Right, now what sort of places does it live in? I said it was a broad-minded snail. Well, this proves the point nice and early in the talk. So we've got sea cliffs. This is in north-east Scotland, Garran Point, site that Richard Marriott has been working on. Another of Richard's sites is in northwest Lancashire. That's Gate Barrows, limestone pavement. And I believe it's also found in limestone pavements on the Burren in Western Ireland. Then in East Anglia, in Suffolk and Norfolk, the tiger angustior is often in huge numbers on grassy embankment, artificial embankments around estuaries. This one is in North Norfolk. There are probably far more in Suffolk around estuaries like the Blythe, for example. And then, of course, we've got salt marsh terrestrial transition zones, which is the sort of habitat that it was found in for the first time in Wales. And in fact, it has been the focus for a lot of work for most of the last 40 years, in fact. Oops, going backwards. Okay, some more habitats. We've got sand dunes. This is a small sand dune system, which has actually since been washed away. That's on the Solway Coast, and in fact, that figures the late, great Barry Colville, who actually found this particular site. Then Pembury Forest, this scruffy looking bit of roadside, in fact, is a site which John Harper found angustior in, much to his surprise and everybody else's. And then we've got dune slacks, which will be the subject of quite a bit of what I say today. You may recognise somebody who's here today. There's Ben Rosen doing some sieving. And finally, inland fens. That's a less well-known fen in Norfolk. Florden Common in Norfolk is perhaps the most famous one. Right, so where are the locations that I'm going to talk about today? Okay, well, first of all, we've got Oxwich, which is, if you look at the map, that's where we are in Wales, southwest Wales. There's Oxwich. Here's the Gower, the beautiful Gower Peninsula. There's Llangennith Burrows, which we've surveyed, but I'm not going to talk about that. And then Whitford Burrows is up here at the northwest. So it's this area and this area. We've also got just north of the Gower an area which has also been shown to support angustior, and that's the Pembury Forest, dunes and salt marshes. I'll talk a little bit about that, but the main focus is not on Pembury, it's on Gower. So Whitford Burrows, oh, I should have said Oxford Burrows is a triple SI. Whitford Burrows is not only a triple SI, but it's also, as I was mentioning a little while ago, it's an SAC, a special area of conservation. And then finally, Llangennith Burrows, a site which a few of us surveyed last October, this area here. I'm not going to be discussing that actually because we didn't find any angustior there. So that's the end of discussing that one. Right, now our story goes back, as I promised you, 193 years to 1830. Now in 1830, Jeffreys, who wrote, as you know, British Conchology, found some dead shells in flood rejectamenta, I think it's described as, he used two site names actually in different publications. He talks about Marino and he also talks about Singleton at Swansea. They happen to be the same place, and that place is where you now have Swansea University. So there were sand dunes here before the university was built. And this illustration here actually is one that in Jeffreys' 1862 volume, he mentioned that there's a very fine illustration of tiger angustior from Weitman's Archive, 1838. I think that's an impressive diagram, quite honestly, considering it was done all that time ago. I mean, it's, you know, you'd have a job to do anything better than that now. Okay, we jumped 94 years now to 1924, when Dr. H.E. Quick significantly found in 24, he found one dead Vertigo, sorry, angustior on the dunes. Then he went back in 1925 and he found 9 dead, some of them quite fresh, 3 sand dune hollows. That's quite interesting, really, because presumably they've been blown in. They weren't living there. And I'll come back to the issue of wind a bit later on. This is the map from his 1925 publication. And he mentions that he found it at 3 locations. Now, whoever edited the journal that year didn't do a terribly good job, because in fact, you've got D, E, you've got all the other letters. He actually didn't put C in. Presumably, if this is sequential, the location C would be there. But actually, looking at although this map is pretty crude, quite honestly, I don't think we'd accept this journal now. It displays really quite accurately what Oxwich is like. It's not that different today. There's a salt marsh at the top. There's sand dunes that come around, and there's a stream coming out here. There's a beach, beautiful beach here, as I say, and then there's the road coming in. Freshwater sort of lake here, and then we go up a hill. Right, that's the... And the Quick continued his searches in 1927, but he didn't succeed in finding any. So it's a sort of disappointing, really. But of course, it was Quick's finds that aroused my curiosity, as you'll see in a minute. Right. So, in fact, 59 years later, from 1976, I, as an A-level biology teacher, ran A-level biology courses to the Gower. And we stayed at a very nice place. We stayed at the Oxwich Bay Hotel, actually. There were certain amounts of time when the students had projects to do, and I could escape for about half a day. And knowing that there was this record of angustior, I was determined to find it. So literally, in bits of odd bits of time, from 1976 up to 1983, I was searching for angustior, knowing it was a marsh species. Of course, I spent a lot of time systematically looking at marshes in the Oxwich area, and I found loads of Vertigo. I didn't find any angustior. Right, then something happened in 1992. Significant find. Ian Clean found angustior in a salt marsh transition zone in Suffolk, which was a new habitat for this snail. So the next time I was in Gower, and in fact I took a party of students. I was accompanied by Richard Priest, who you'll see here. Look, in the blue anorak. I think he's still got that anorak, actually. We gave the students a project. We thought we'll escape for half a day. And I knew Whitford Burrows had lots of salt marsh transition zones, so we thought, well, let's go over there and see what we can find. We did. We parked. We walked. Within about 2 or 3 seconds of kneeling down, I found angustior, which was really quite a big surprise. We found lots of them, actually. We tracked it over a good few, 100 meters or so. We had a bit of spare time. We drove back to Oxwich, and we picked up that a couple of the plants were quite good indicators. Silverweed, Potentilla anserina, and Iris pseudochorus, were 2 features that figured in where we were finding the snail. We went back to Oxwich, parked the minibus, and then headed towards the salt marsh at the northern end of the sand dunes. We went looking for silverweed, looking for iris. We went there, knelt on the ground. We got another population of angustior, which was quite honestly, I don't think I've ever beaten that record. So there was 2 populations within about 4 hours of each other. And they were the first populations, living populations in Wales. In fact, they were the first living populations at that stage in Western Britain. And so that started the ball rolling. Right. I should have clicked these, shouldn't I? Right, there's, that actually, I've lost the slides that I took. That was a slide from 19 1983 with Richard. This is a more recent slide, but it shows you the general gist of what it was like when we found it in 1983 in the sand dune salt marsh transition zone. Okay, right. So as I've just mentioned, two of the plants that were quite good indicators, well, it proved to be quite good indicators on that day, were iris and silverweed. And then we wrote a small, Richard and I wrote a small note which appeared in the Journal of Conchology. Right, now we jump 10 years ahead to 1993, and Ian Killeen, who was, I was teaching, I couldn't get back there very easily, was given a contract to go and look at Whitford and Oxwich from what was then Countryside Council for Wales. And this was in January, by the way, he did this work, which I think was quite brave of him. He went to Whitford first of all, and he surveyed. This is actually not Ian's map. This is one I produced, or this was produced more recently, digitizing the hand-drawn locations that Ian had put in his report. So that's not from that time. It's being produced more recently. But this shows you that he surveyed up nearly to the top of the transition zone, didn't find it. The positive sites are all compressed down here. In fact, there's a seawall here, and this is something called Combe Ivy Marsh, which I'll be talking about. He tried looking there and didn't find it. So the extent of the positive records was down in this transition zone in the southeast corner. And the snails were, again, Ian describes them being found in largely the same sort of botanical association that they were found in 10 years earlier. Right, and it was stated in the report that the snail was restricted to the salt marsh sand dune transition zone. Now, because there are two parts to this story, there's Whitford and there's Oxwich, so we can't talk simultaneously about both of them. So we're going to largely focus, first of all, on Whitford boroughs to see what's happened there, and then we're going to come back to Oxwich and talk about what's happened there, and then finally we'll try and make some sense of all this. Right, oh, that is the map that came out of the original report, and in fact it was this important study that kind of set the scene, almost created what you might tenderly call a paradigm for work over much of the next 40 years, and that was that Vertigo angustior is a thing that lives in the transition zone between salt marshes and sand dunes. And so the focus was very much on that for a long time. Okay, so Ian did his work in 93, and then this was followed on for 3 years by what was then Countryside Council for Wales. They set up some monitoring plots at a point, again, in the southeast, where Ian had found perhaps the largest aggregations of angustior. And in fact, they set up, the first year, they set up two, one down on the marsh, which they weren't getting angustior in, one further up, and then in 1995, the chronology appears in a minute. Right, so 94 to 96, they did work. 94, 95, 96, the reports all follow a year later. And then all this work was summarized by Adrian Fells in a special Journal of Conchology publication. So that shows you some of the sort of brief synopsis of the results from two of the plots. Plot A is missing because it didn't produce any angustior. They introduced the second plot in the second year, and you can see the numbers go up and down, which is in fact very much what happens if you look at angustior populations. It's very difficult to come up with a sort of standard story for what's happening in terms of population numbers at particular times of the year. Right. So that went on for 3 years, 79 to 90. Sorry, that should be 1919. Yeah, no, that's right. Wait a minute. That we had 3 years of surveys between 97 and 99, got the numbers wrong way around there. Right, so what conclusions did they draw from the work over those 3 years? Well, they concluded that at both its well sites, that the snail lives in this narrow transition zone. And that they described the National Vegetational Classification typical best habitat as MG11 for Stuca rubra, Agrostis stolonifera, Potentilla anserina, that's silverweed. Okay, right. Then Cum Ivy Marsh, following the 97 survey, David Holyoake and I were asked to go back and look at Cum Ivy Marsh. Nobody really looked at it. That's the site at right at the south of Whitford Burrows. That is a picture actually that I took in 1983. We did a fairly detailed study. It was David Holyoake, Jerry Holyoake and myself. We stayed for several days and looked over this site. By the way, you wouldn't see it like that now. The seawall broke down about 4 or 5 years ago, and most of this is now salt marsh. There's a transition zone at the top, but all this iris that you can see is all salt marsh vegetation now. So Richard and I found low numbers of angustior in 83. We had a quick look at this. We did an amazing amount actually on that day. We found it in low numbers in 83. Then Ian looked and he didn't get it in 93. Then our survey, which I've just been talking about in 98, we found dead shells, but we didn't find signs of anything living. The next time that it was found was actually John Harper in 2006. I'll talk more about him in a minute. He found 2 right at the head of the marsh. I'll show you a map actually with his sights on. Right, so Cum Ivy Marsh, not a great place, never produced very many, and in fact the most recent surveys, as you'll see, it doesn't seem to be, if it's there, it's in incredibly low numbers. Right, then we come to, I think it was decided that some serious research needed to be done, and that's where Eva Sharland, under the direction of Robert Cameron, who's very pleased to see here today, undertook a study, and she did it again. She's stayed pretty much in this area, this hotspot area, which Adrian Fowles had worked on in the southeast, and she did some remarkably detailed work, regular sampling along transects, fixed point monitoring plots, and she did this over about 18 months, I think. So she has produced valuable information, population changes, as you'll see in a sec, snail growth, reproductive strategies, plant associations, and survey techniques. Right, now this was something she produced in her PhD. This is reproduced again by Robert Cameron in 2003 in the Hellier publication, and it shows the remarkably detailed work that Eva did in a plot, looking at very, very fine detail at the particular plant communities, or particular plant associations, and presence of the snail. I mean, it must have, driven a mad doing this, quite honestly. Huge patience to do this. Right, so here's some examples of some of the things she produced. First of all, she dissected quite a lot of the tigos there and discovered that up to 100% of them were aphallic. In other words, they were only able to reduce by parthenogenesis. This is actually quite a useful thing for the snail, as we'll see a bit later on. Then she looked at plant associations and reinforcing the work of Ian and Adrian Fowles and his colleagues, that it was most plentiful where you had iris and certain low herbaceous things like silverweed. But what she did find actually is that it is actually in fairly low numbers in a number of other plant communities. This wasn't really followed up much after that. She didn't go really much beyond the transition zone with her work. but there is some interesting stuff here if you look at it and pick up the significance of this. And then she also did studies, counts over the 18-month period, not literally every month. I think there's a break in the winter where she looked at the numbers of angustior. She did other histograms where she looked at the adults and the juveniles and various other things. It's difficult to, there is some sort of pattern here, but it's difficult to make too much of it. You'll also, a lot on this particular diagram, a lot of the standard error bars overlap, which presumably means that we've not got necessarily statistical significance on some of these. There may be a difference, but is it significant? We'll come back to looking at life histories, but she made a pretty good go at this. But it was over 18 months, and I think most people would agree, to get a really good picture, it would have been good to carry on for perhaps a good few more years. And even then, that would only have been the life history at one place, in one set of weather conditions. Right, another thing she did was to actually look at how you sample for Vertigo angustior. Some of you maybe, if you're not familiar with this, how on earth do you find this thing? It's very, very small. Well, in fact, she looked at removing the top litter and a piece of ground and seeing how many of the snails you got in it. And then she did it including the vegetation cut right down to ground level, scraping the soil surface. And she did a third approach where she went down about 2 or 3 centimeters into the ground as well. She found that you got the best bang for your buck, if you like, by using the first two strategies. You remove the loose litter, you cut the vegetation down to the soil surface level. You don't bother to go into the soil. You don't get very many more that way. And so that is largely the way that you survey for, that's largely the way you would go about sampling for Vertigo angustior. Right, so this is actually one of the people from Natural Resources Wales who've been helping me. This is Karen Wilkinson, who is an ace botanist. She's here collecting a sample. She's scraping the soil surface there and then bagging it up, bagging up these two samples into a bulk sample bag, which would contain about 3 litres. That stuff is then dried out in muslin bags. Well, that's the way I do it. And then till it's completely dry, till it's constant mass, all the water's gone, and then you put it through a nest of sieves, 2 millimeters down to 0.5 millimeter, catches these. A few tiny juveniles might get through that, but you're getting most of the adults and juveniles that way. Now, one of the, I'll come on in a minute to a suggestion on a monitoring protocol that somebody from Natural Resources Wales came up with, suggesting that you could do the surveys for this by just sieving in the field. And you didn't need to go through this palaver. But in fact, interestingly, in the 3 surveys at Whitford, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, in 2018 we got angustior at 7 sites, and we only picked it up in the field at 2 of those. So 5 of them we needed the bulk sample for. In 2021 we got angustior at 6 new sites, but we only picked it up. We picked it up in the field at 4. We would have missed 2, and this last year we found it at 4 more sites. Only 2 of them did we pick it up in the field. We got the other 2 were picked up in some cases in quite large numbers from the bulk samples. So bulk sampling does seem to be quite an important approach. You can't really reliably rely, particularly if the snails there in lowish numbers, on just sieving and looking in the field. It's a tiny snail, actually. It's a real challenge. Probably a little bit more widespread than we think, mainly because it's a difficult thing to spot. Okay. Right. So further detailed CCW studies took place in the transition zone around about 2000, and this involved very detailed studies of the iris-dominated area. And in fact, Adrian Fowles and Daniel Guest came up with this monitoring strategy which was proposed as a way to assess the condition of the snail at Whitford. In fact, it's very specific. If you look, it says the definition of optimum Vertigo angustior habitat, that within a half a meter circumference, or so half a centimeter radius, you have to find 10 or more plants, iris plants, and then a certain amount of cover of lotus. So it's very, very specific, this. You know, that's what the habitat is. It's got to have iris seem to be assumed a huge importance. And, you know, perhaps people lost focus on looking elsewhere. Right. A really important visit took place in 2006. A chap called John Harper, who very sadly died about 2 months ago. I tried to get in contact with him, and he discovered that he had very sadly passed away. But he doing work on spiders, I think it was, on Pembury, which is just north of Gower, picked up an angustior in 2005. He was commissioned to go to Pembury and look more widely for angustior, but so he could get his eye in. He was a very sort of very careful, fastidious person. He decided to come to Gower to go to sites where angustior was known to be living and try out using a vacuum sampler, and also to get his eye in for the thing. He went to Whitford Burrows. These are the 4 sites where he tried out his vacuum sampler, and he found, actually, interestingly, he found it at 2 sites, just single shells in Coombe Ivy Marsh, right near the seawall. He found it in the very well recorded transition zone, but really significantly, he found it here. He just went a little inland into the dunes, and he found it in Salix repens, dune slag, which in fact it hints at Salix repens in Eva's PhD, but nobody really looked very much at the dune slags with Salix repens in. Anyway, he not only found it there, but he got a really good number. He got nearly 300 in a square meter. So it was clearly quite an important habitat. So, you know, in 2006, that perhaps should have stimulated people to think, well, hang on a minute, you know, he's finding this in dwarf willow sites, but perhaps we should look at more of them. But nobody did for a while. Right. So as I pointed out, this dune slag sample produced 272 per square meter, which is no small number. It was clearly doing quite well there. This is the first significant and you know, recognized find of this snail in this particular habitat. Right, then 2000, between the sampling using the monitoring protocol, which I described a little while ago, that took place up to about 2012. Natural Resources Wales, or CCW, I can't remember where they switched actually, went back and monitored the place and assessed using the technique of field-only assessment and going to that same place that everybody else had been going to, that things were okay. They were judged as favourable. Then in 2016, Karen Wilkinson went back again and got some alarming results. In fact, this comes out of, this is, as it says here, she was using the technique of fowls and guests, and in fact, at the monitoring sections A to F, the numbers of angustior that she was recovering, well, she didn't get it at all in in 3 of these, and she got very low numbers in the others. In fact, it was feared at this point that angustior, for some reason or other, was on the way out at Whitford. It seemed to be, you know, going down the pan. Right. Okay, now that was 2016. 2018, I was asked by Natural Resources Wales, or CCW, then Countryside Council of Wales, to do a survey of some wetlands at Llangennith Moors, which was actually a fairly crummy place, actually. We didn't get very much there. I was given quite a few days to do this. We'd finished it off fairly quickly, actually, and I had a bit of spare time left. And I suggested, well, why don't we go back to Whitford? I knew I was working with Karen Wilkinson and Dan Guest, and we thought, well, let's use a spare day. Let's just pop back and see what we can find at Whitford. Has it gone down the pan, as you suspect? And so, in fact, in the day, fortunately, I had Dan Guest, Karen Wilkinson with me. We were able to move really fast. So we did this in one day. We took samples from right up at the far north, which is further north than anybody had sampled before, right down into Combe Marsh down here. And these were all results largely obtained from bulk samples. Well, this is quite a revelation, actually, because not only were we finding the thing, but we increased its range from about 0.7 of a kilometre, which was the distance that he had got it, up to 1.9 kilometres, a 1.2 kilometre increase. The habitat may have changed. I discussed this in the report, and Ian thought that the conditions further north were too wet for it, but it was certainly not on its last legs. This is good news. So did this allay the 2016 worries? Well, the question arose, well, if it's doing so well in the transition zone, or if it's certainly more widespread than we suspected, but what about looking elsewhere? Nobody had really looked at the dunes. From 1983 to this point, nobody had ventured in to see if it was more widespread. So there was then a COVID break in proceedings. I was planning to go back in 2019 and 20, but COVID stopped that one in its tracks. But then 2021, I went back with Dan and Karen, and we actually spent 3 days here, and we looked in more detail, and we actually looked at I think it was 27 sites. I think it was. Can't see number 20. That's 26. Yeah, 29. Yeah, 29 sites. So this is the result of this. This deliberately didn't focus on the transition zone, which is this area here. Those were further into the dunes. This is Combe Marsh, which proved we thought we'd have a good look at that. That proved negative. But interestingly, it's turning up in good numbers, well away from the transition zone. These are all dune slacks. 6 sites, all in Salix repens dune slacks. Now, interestingly, some of these they weren't just all open dune slacks. They were actually, some of them rather partially shaded. Something should be clicking in here. Well, that is putting the results of the 2 years, 18 and 21, into context with the previous work. You'll see that all the previous, this is just these dots. The red is the work that was done from 2018. Stars are 18, circles are 21. The blue, positive results for angustior in all the previous years, right back to the time it was found. You can see how clustered they are. Those 2 blue dots are the sites on Combe Marsh that John Harper found. So, looking at some of the habitats that it turned up in, that's open dune slack. This was an unusual dune slack surrounded by Corsican pine, actually. Very untypical sort of place, nothing like the transition zone. And then also some of the slacks were partly shaded by grey willow. In fact, there's something called Laura here sampling in this dappled shade. The willow did go into this shade, but again, it's quite atypical really for angustior to find it tolerating quite a little bit of shade. That's Karen taking a bearing, one of the stalwarts of the team that I'm working with. Right, so then we come to 2022, and the Thatcher and Bith, which you might have heard of, it's the Welsh equivalent of the Back from the Brink project. asked various people to do various work, and this snail was actually picked up as something that was worth looking at, and possibly trying to bring back from the brink. Anyway, a further visit in 2022. The time was limited because there was only a certain amount of time available, a limited amount of time at Whitford. Llangennith Burrows, I mentioned, was used up time, as it proved, with no good positive results, and then the rest at Oxwich, which we'll come on to in a minute. Right, so the fairly short, it's only one day we were able to do in October 2022, but again, we did 6 sites, 8 sites. Half of them have got angustior in. These are all new slacks, and look, they're way over to the western side. Most of these negatives were in quite shaded situations. That's interesting, 4 and 5. That is the same June slack. It was in quite large numbers at one end of the slack. It wasn't at the other end at all. Okay, that's a sort of combination of all the results, positive and negative, from the start of this new program in 2018. Getting excited, that isn't it? Right, and again, that's putting the positives, all the positives, into context. The 2018, 21, 22 in context with all the previous positive records. You can see the recent work has greatly increased the range, and it's started to reveal the presence of the snail well away from the transition zone, well away from a high risk, and all of those indicators that were thought to be critically important for it. Okay, so here we are, the last shots of these were last October. One of the questions that rose from the work in 2021 and 22 is, why is the snail in some of the June slacks, but it's not in others that seem to be absolutely, identical? Maybe it's groundwater, we don't have the details, or maybe there are other factors, which I'll come on to discuss in a minute. Okay, this also, I'm going to be calling upon some work that Evelyn Moorkens did in 2003 in Western Ireland, on a site, or a really big site actually, which was subsequently bought by Donald Trump for a golf course, but it was a really good angustior site. One of the reasons she feels it does so well in Western Ireland is it's very humid there, it rains a lot, but it's the high humidity. It's an oceanic climate. Whitford Burrows certainly has parallels with Western Ireland, I would say. And Whitford is stuck right out. It gets a lot of wind, but it gets a lot of oceanic humidity, and it gets a lot of sea mist. And maybe this is actually really quite favourable to angustior. Maybe there's a difference even between Whitford and Oxwich, which is sort of in a rain shadow further to the east. Okay, right. So 10 years later, we're going back in time now to Ian and his work in January 1993. He went to Oxwich as well. He had a grid reference which Richard Priest and I had taken, and he went and used that as a sort of, it wasn't done with a GPS, so it was probably a bit inaccurate actually, but he went back to where he thought we had been. He visited 17 sites and over about 150 meters. This is not the map from Ian's report. This is what I produced based on his hand-drawn map in his report. And fortunately, he put his hand-drawn spots over a grid, over an ordnance survey map, as I was able to use some sort of aerial photographs and a lot of sort of hard work to work out roughly where his grid references would land. Of course, these could be a little bit inaccurate because he wasn't using a GPS, but basically he was finding it. He found these were his samples. The red stars are where he got it. He got it very close. What is interesting, and I'm going to come back to this as well, if you look at, this is a modern aerial photograph of this area. You can see all this tree cover here. Ian was finding it then, according to that, in fairly dense alders and willow. Well, of course he wasn't. This is all stuff that has actually all this tree growth is relatively recent. And in fact, it's something that maybe it's a conservation management failing, but this has happened. But it's certainly not helped the transition zone. Anyway, so he found it at 5 sites. He only got 12 snails. He concluded that it wasn't doing very well there, that it was confined at best to 100 meters of the dune salt marsh transition zone. And there is a scan of the map from Ian's 1993 report. So he's stating that's the distribution of angustior at Oxwich. And again, well, it's this basically. Okay. Another thing he mentioned, which is relevant to what I was just saying about tree growth, he noted in his report a worrying increase in the saplings, alder and willow saplings coming in. Right, these are scans from his report. They're a bit blurry, but it shows the habitat in that transition zone, which I've been to recently, is pretty much, there's no trees there. This is now covered with alder and willow. There's scrub coming in, but it's still largely as I remembered it in 1983. Again, a view looking to the east. That's Three Cliffs Bay. Again, Ian's photograph shows the site to be essentially open. Right, 1994 to 96, Natural Resources Wales also visited the site at the sort of more or less the same time that they were visiting Whitford Burrows. Right, so in 94, they went to where Ian had found it a year before and only found one dead shell. So that didn't look very good. And in the report it states, habitat suitable for maintaining a population of Vertigo angustior at Oxwich must certainly be very limited. In 95, they didn't bother to sample at all. They thought the habitat was too poor. But what they did do, and this is mentioned 3 times in this report, is to state that, however, what is really required at Oxwich is a detailed survey of the entire fringe of the salt marsh to determine whether any suitable habitat survives and whether angustior is still present. Well, that didn't happen, unfortunately. I mean, it's probably a funding thing, but it was recognized that really somebody ought to look more widely. It didn't happen. The following year, interestingly, they went back again. They didn't take grid references, unfortunately. They've got rough plots as to where they went. But surprisingly, they went a little bit further along to the east, and they did find angustior, including in one site, they got 48 adults, and that was in the field. So it was clearly a good population there. So it had obviously slipped under the radar in the previous 2 years. Nothing happened beyond that, though, which is surprising, I suppose. Right, that's the habitat. These are scanned pictures out of Adrian Fowles's reports. Again, it shows pretty much what Ian is showing, that the site is not covered with trees at this point. Right, 10 years later, John Harper went with his vacuum sampler, and then 10 years after that, Natural Resources Wales went there. This is this is actually 20 years worth of what happened on Oxwich. So the blue is where, from 96 to 2016, people sampled. We've got a rough idea of where they went. They didn't find it. Red is where they did find it. And interestingly, here, the red dot is seemingly where Adrian found it in 2006, and it wasn't found, sorry, in 1996, 10 years later. In fact, John Harper went with somebody called Chris Painter, I think his name was. He took him to where they found it before, and they didn't find it. So there's clearly some dynamics going on here. The snail isn't, if you find it in a place, doesn't guarantee that it's going to be there when next time you go. Right, now the work again, this is the fairly new work. Last October, as part of the Back from the Brink, I spent 4 days or part days at Oxwich, and that I went to, I think it was 24 sites. focusing actually quite a lot in the inner dunes on dune slacks with Salax repens in, which may have been a mistake actually, as you'll see. But interestingly, the snail, it hasn't gone. It turned up at 4 sites. 2 of them, these 2 here, are basically in the transition zone, what's left of it at the eastern end. But very, very interestingly, it turned up there. That's on a semi-fixed dune. Now, I was with my wife. We walked from the beach across here, and I thought, well, I might as well take a sample. It's almost certainly not suitable for it, because there was patches of bare sand and there was marram grass, and it was, but seemingly a completely unsuitable place. But I thought, well, I'm here. I'm not going to be coming back here anytime soon. I'll take a sample, which I did. Amazingly, that sample in what seems to be completely unsuitable habitat turned up the largest number of angustiors. And that was at the end of a hot, dry summer. I was completely amazed, actually. And the other one that's significant is this one here, which is there's a dune ridge there. This is in a dune slack. Only just a couple of individuals. But again, 2 new habitats at Ox, which is clearly more widespread than we suspected. In fact, having picked it up at that site, it suggests that future visits, and it's not the end of the story, ought to go back to some of these open dune sites and look at fixed and semi-fixed dunes. I mean, is it more widespread? We don't know. This is not the end of the story. Right. So 2 populations. Right, now that is a sort of very confusing map. That's a compilation of the work up to 2022, and then the stars are the 2022 survey. You can see how all the previous work over nearly 40 years has just been concentrated in this area here, on the assumption that it's only in the transition zone. Right, these new habitats, semi-fixed dunes, this is the site. This was the best site in terms of the numbers I found, which again, at the time seemed highly unsuitable. That is the dune slack. You can see the Salax repens there. That's Dan Guest doing his botanical work, and that's one of the transition zones which might have recorded it previously. Okay, right, tree growth at Oxwich is something I've mentioned. This is the map from Quick's 3rd publication in 1927. It's quite a good map, actually. Again, it's pretty much like this. He did record the presence of trees there. He recorded the salt marsh margin. He records no trees in this area here at all. So this tree growth is a relatively recent phenomenon, and perhaps not a terribly helpful one, but it seems to have happened pretty much since 1983 at least. There we are. This is again that map that aerial photograph I've shown you before. There are no trees there. Look at the tree growth we've got now. Amazing amount of successional change, and that's the area where the 1983 and 1993 surveys found it. You don't find it there now. I spent a long time taking a lot of samples in this area during the last October. Didn't get it at all. Where I did get it was, of course, out here, a completely seemingly unsuitable habitat. So, oops, there we are. Point I just made. Tree cover over previously open transition zone. So this is something that's worrying, and perhaps needs to be addressed if it's not too late. We're getting obviously a different habitat with different things in it. If you come down to ground level, you can see how significant this is. That is Dan, right? This is salt marsh here. That is the edge of the transition zone. We've got alder here, completely covering it. There is what part of the conservation plan has fenced the area of dunes in, so they can have some sort of low-level cattle and horse grazing on the salt marsh. But it's the trees are going right up to the fence line. There is no transition zone there at all now. Here again, a close up. These hummocks apparently did support angustior in the past. No chance now. This willow and alder shading them. Right, so lessons learned at Oxwich and Whitford, that it lives in a far wider range of habitats than we previously believed. It's not restricted to the salt marsh transition zones, and that has been the focus of pretty much all the work for nearly 40 years from the first discoveries, which were in a transition zone. So the snails have been recorded in a pretty diverse range of plant communities. I won't go through this. This is just a bit of a summary of some of the NVC categories that it's been living in. Sand dune communities, most notably. So basically, we've got semi-fixed dunes, we've got dune grassland, that's fixed dunes, and then various types of dune slacks. But it's also found in slight woodland, certainly where you get the sun coming from the west on Whitford Burrows. It's in mires and obviously on salt marsh margins, and there's more. The work on this hasn't finished yet, the analysis of all the botanical work from last October. So now, Robert, I'm quoting you here. This is a very good statement. So this, I mean, of course, all of this isn't some new. I've not made a breakthrough here. Robert had more or less said this 20 years ago. This is from Hellier. What does he say? Wise words. A review of the literature shows that there are no consistent associations with particular plant communities, but rather with a particular combination of environmental conditions. These include permanent dampness without inundation, herbaceous or other cover supplying litter, friable refuges, not dense grazed turf with a tough root mat, and relative openness rather than heavy shade caused by trees or very dense bulbs. So it's a slight elaboration of what Michael Kearney came up with. But again, I rather like this one, Robert. I think it's rather a good statement.
No.
Right, now, back to a question I asked a little while ago, a question that I asked myself. Why at Whitford, and also to some extent at Oxwich, do we have angustior in some slacks, but then in others which looking seemingly pretty much perfect for it? It's not there. Has this got something to do, and I'm indebted to Robert here, we had a long telephone chat about this a few days ago. Should we be looking at metapopulation dynamics here? Now, metapopulation dynamics is something that explains, or has been used to explain, the patchy distribution of Vertigo valenciana down river corridors. You know, it comes and goes at various places. Is that what is happening in these dune slacks? Two factors greatly assist in this process. Right. So is it, yeah, sorry, I should have read this bit up. As conditions fluctuate in particular slacks, this is my suggestion, these slacks are often isolated from other slacks. So they're like biological islands, if you like. Vertigo angustior may die out, or numbers may fall to very low levels. This, of course, can happen with extreme changes in weather from year to year. But with improved conditions, populations might bounce back either from a very low level where you can barely detect the snail, it's hanging on just about, or does it recolonize from other slacks? Right, well, there are two things in its favor here. First of all, Vertigo angustior is tiny. It's a tiny little thing. Remember the quick, I mentioned that he found it in 1926, not living, but in hollows where snails had been blown. In fact, he found it together with salt marsh snails. It shows snails are blowing around quite a bit. Right, there's no shortage of wind in the Gower. And in fact, if you ask Swansea Council about this, they will tell you that they have to spend, well, according to this source, that is a path behind some rather small dunes near the Mumbles in Swansea, and it's covered with sand. Swansea Council spend £20,000 a year clearing the sand deposits. Now, this snail isn't much bigger, as I said, than a sand grain. So I'm suggesting that it gets around fairly easily by being blown around. Another thing that helps it, and something I mentioned before, Right, parthenogenesis. You only need one of these critters into a site and it can get going again. It doesn't need, two to mate, it just needs one. So get one in, blown in, and it can re-establish a population. And that's again, I'm repeating this histogram from Eva Charland's work, where she showed that up to 100% of the angustiors she fastidiously dissected were aphalic. Okay, right. Something that I've had long chats with Evelyn Moorkens in Ireland, who's done lots of work on this in Western Ireland. And the Domore golf course area I mentioned, she knew that possibly had angustior. She actually did perhaps what we should have done in Gower about 40 years ago. She surveyed the whole system systematically, taking samples in all the habitats. And what she found was that, yes, there are different numbers in different in different vegetational types, but the snail is there to some extent in all of them. And then what she also found is that there are changes from year to year. So in 2000, this is selectively taking some data from some of her publications. She found that in the dry year, in the fixed dunes, which are relatively, as the name suggests, they're quite dry, fixed dunes, relatively low numbers of angustior and pretty good numbers in a wetland area. The following year, she did the same study, more or less the same time. She got a very different picture. Admittedly, it is only 1 year, but she's suggesting that, in fact, there's something important here, and that is that depending on whether you've got a dry year or a wet year, it's useful to have a mosaic of habitats for this snail. So, and here we've got what I call the Moorkens gainer hypothesis. Experiences in this dune system suggest the wetland areas may be critical to the tiger angustior, such that in dry years the snail may find refuge in the wetland areas. Conversely, in very wet years, when the wetland areas are too wet for the species, the dune element becomes essential habitat. Thus, both types of habitats are required, she maintains, to ensure long-term survival of the population. And of course, you've got this mosaic actually at Whitford and Gower, although to some extent we're losing some of the mosaic because of successional change. Right, so survey and monitoring. The mostly irregular survey and monitoring of most populations doesn't really give us a clear understanding of their conservation status. So what conservation measures to adapt, to adopt, and to assess? Regular surveys of a few sites are really required, and there aren't very many of these. If you just go for 2 or 3 years and then you leave it 20 years and go back again, you're really not getting much of a picture. You need to select sites where you know this snail is and go there and look year after year and relate that to water table and climatic conditions. Otherwise, you're just not going to get snapshot visits, just don't give you an accurate picture. So this is, again, I'm calling upon something of yours here, Robert. I've slightly modified it. In monitoring and trying to understand population dynamics and in assessing the condition of a Vertigo angustior population, account should be taken of these limitations. Patterns of life history and population dynamics vary in site-specific ways. So again, coming up with a hypothesis on life history from one site is unwise. Such patterns are weather dependent and may vary between years at the same site, which is what Evelyn Moorkens found. Actually, John Harper in Pembury did work in 2006, 2012, and 13, and he found huge changes at the same site between surveys at those different years. In some cases, they found large populations in 2006 at some sites in Pembury. He didn't find them at all there in 2013. He found a big population looking for spiders in 2012. He went back to the same place a year later and he couldn't find them. So, this thing is going up and down like a yo-yo. Here's another more words of wisdom from Beata Brock. I'm Procrisco, that's right. Viata procrisco. Right. Any student trying to extrapolate results based on a single population of a tiger nad should be warned against the possibility of population dynamics changing with geographical position. That quote's been used by quite a few people, actually, so I'm popping it in as well. And finally, Evelyn, indeed it is concluded that results from a number of years of survey at this level will be required before natural fluctuations and recoveries within the site population are understood and meaningful levels of acceptable change in the population identified. So these are all more or less saying the same thing, really. So for understanding this snail, we need to select some sites, we need to go back. It's going to be tedious and boring, perhaps, but that's what research is about, and that's what's needed. But that hasn't really been happening for angustior to any great degree. So we reach the end of the story, or the end of my talk, but this is not the end of the story, because obviously, if you can see, even though 40 years ago I turned this thing up, we're still learning a lot about this broad-minded snail. Broad-minded, lives in a wide variety of habitats. It isn't as narrow-minded as we thought in limiting itself to a particular habitat at Gower. So thank you very much for listening to this. I don't think I've seen too many people dozing off. I've got to thank people, a lot of people, and I have a job to try to put this in a fairly concise way. First of all, I've got to thank Mike Howe, who's been a stalwart with Natural Resources Wales, not just for the snails, but for all sorts of invertebrates. He's amazing. He supported the project on this vertigo and various others as well, like angustior, Balinsiana, and Vilgeborgi. Then the team of botanists I've been working with in the last 3 years, again, I couldn't really do the botany without them. That's Karen Wilkinson and Dan Guest. They are fantastic. Many of these fantastic maps you've seen, they're not my work, most of them, that you can thank Kat Hammond for that. She worked her magic on those, very patient with me, going back with requests to tweak them in certain ways, but she didn't lose her cool. She stuck with it. Then I'm indebted to lots of other people for many different reasons. So here's some of the key ones. Ben Rosen, had lots of chats with Ben. He's been out in the field, actually seen angustior out at Whitford, and I've had many chats with him. He's helped me in innumerable ways, and I'm hoping he's going to be becoming a bigger part of the project on angustior going forward. Then Robert Cameron, who I've referred to a few times today, provided me with stuff, and of course is a mine of information and challenging discussion on this. Richard Marriott, up in North East Scotland, of course, found populations of angustior at Garran Point and Red Point, and also worked with Barry Colville and more recently with myself at Whiteport on the Solway, looking at this snail. Evelyn Moorkens, again, I've referred to several times, and Ian Colleen. They've done a lot of work on this. They did some really important studies actually in Suffolk, looking at populations around the Blythe estuary, but they've done a lot of work in Ireland as well. And Ian, of course, did the second study in 1993. Then I can't leave this talk without thanking Richard Priest, who I think is listening in somewhere in the background. Richard was with me on that amazing day in 1983 where we found angustior in 2 places in a few hours, which a record I've not beaten since. And somebody else who I've very much enjoyed doing field work on angustior with, and that's David Hollyoak. Again, I think he's listening in the background there somewhere as well. He's done quite a lot of work on this species. And then I must finish off by paying tribute to John Harper, who very sadly, as I discovered when I was trying to get him on the phone, discovered that he died. I think it was in January this year. I mean, he wasn't just good on mollusks. He was really a polymath. He looked at spiders and all sorts, and with equal enthusiasm. And although he was just dabbling in on the edges at Whitford and Oxwich, I mean, he came up with some really good stuff. actually just doing those trial vacuum samplings. And then Barry Colville, again, who died just over a year ago. Barry, again, did loads of work on many different Vertigo species, but he was important in doing a lot of the early work on the Solway population. Again, there will be an obituary on outlining the huge amount of stuff that Barry's done on Vertigos in a forthcoming Conchological Society publication. Anyway, so there we are. You've been very patient. You've listened to me for possibly too long. I had a sort of more or less had a script here, and I've indulged myself. So right.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay, well there we are. That's it. Right. Well, to speculate, in June slacks, it might be associated with salinity levels. If slacks are seasonally or periodically wet from flood tides, most of the slacks, who's asked that question, most of the slacks are not in any way influenced by salt, the ones I looked at. They've got plant communities which wouldn't tolerate almost any salt at all. So they may have salt spray at Whitford, but they're not, these aren't slacks that are subject to any sort of tidal influences. Yes, actually in Ireland, Evelyn looked at the issue of sites being artificially fertilized, and that apparently causes vegetation to rot down rather quickly, and that deprives snails of food, apparently. It's quite a complex issue.
Peter is saying more there.
Oh, right. What else is he saying?
Although I'm not a botanist, I've worked on a couple of dune slack sites in Scotland, and these habitats are rapidly changing due to high concentrations of atmospheric deposition, especially nitrogen, which this change favours a different suite of plant species that were previously present in what were once nutrient poor habitats.
Yeah. I think the Whitford population, the Whitford slacks are pretty pristine, actually, because Whitford is stuck right out. There's not much local pollution there. Oxwich may be a little more favoured by nitrogen pollution, but Whitford is pretty pristine, actually. There's not, it faces straight out to the open ocean. So Mags has just a statement interesting about importance of habitat mosaics. It's fairly obvious, really. A lot of this stuff is fairly obvious, actually. Robert has got a question.
Very minor, very technical correction. Not parthenogenesis, it's self-fertilizing. It can be a very significant.
It is different, you're absolutely right, yes. Because parthenogenesis is a development of an unfertilized egg.
Yes.
And this is fertilizing itself.
Yes.
Yeah. No, that isn't made very clear, is it?
And occasionally, I mean that most of them are italic, but some are in doubt. And it seems to be enough to keep a fair degree of genetic variation in the population.
Yeah, I think a number of people are under the impression it was parthenogenesis, but essentially it's doing the same job, of course.
Yes, yeah.
Although it's a sort of self.
Yeah. I mean, I had two other comments. One is, which entirely supports what you've been saying. If I remember looking at Eva Charland's results in detail, you could have two quadrats within possibly 5 meters of one another, with very similar vegetation cover, and one would have 100 perishing angustior in, and the other one would have none whatsoever. So, I mean, and I think the answer is, you're right, you get an accidental dispersal. If they're lucky and they land in the right kind of place, then they breed vertigos breed pretty rapidly on the whole. And the other thing is, where you've got a high population density, and as you say, they're spread a bit by the wind and so on, even possibly by animals passing through the vegetation. Hence, you get very low numbers in what you might think are rather unsuitable habitats. I mean, some of the calcareous grasslands behind the dunes in Whitford, I mean, you could get a very similar vegetation composition on some downland. Now, all right, somebody will now tell me they found angustior on downland, but I rather doubt it. And I think it's this question of whether it's a source. And the final thing I would say is, I don't know whether Evelyn and Ian have ever been back to Suffolk. And the reason I ask this is that those habitats, which we know are artificial, and indeed we can date them, if they've gone extinct, it's very good proof that you said something which is right. Namely, as far as I know, there is no wetland refuge for them there. They have colonized that transition between the dike and the salt marsh, and in huge numbers. But if for any reason that weather or floods, they went extinct, is there a source? It seemed to me that from what I remember, mind you, of course, they may not have looked everywhere. One of the really revealing things about your talk is if you, as it were, take the path less trodden and just go a little bit around, you find some quite surprising things.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if those dikes, and I've seen them in Norfolk more than in Suffolk, but the picture I showed was one up in North Norfolk, which is very similar to the ones in Suffolk. But there could well be fens behind those. And again, I was taken around by Roy Baker and Derek Howlett to a lot of the sites that they knew in Norfolk for angustior. And it's an amazingly diverse.
Yeah.
And again, then Florden Common is the famous site.
Yeah.
But there are quite a lot of other fens very similar to that.
Yes.
And it's quite possible, again, if they weren't looking at all the fens adjacent to those sea walls, that there could be Vertigo angustior populations there. But all of those populations on those sea walls, and they are probably the sort of the most Vertigos on the GB mainland are there. They're massively vulnerable to sea level rise.
Yes.
And we've already, I didn't touch on this because I didn't think there'd be time, but Ian, Evelyn and I did a contract in 2017 looking at all the Vertigos in Scotland. I did Western Scotland and they did the East. We looked at Gower, Genesii and angustior. And I looked at angustior on the Solway with Richard Marriott, who'd been there with Barry Colville. The sand dune system completely gone. We spent a day there, we couldn't find anything at all there. Completely gone and it was reckoned to be a particular storm that came from the south. But again, sea level rise, and it's happening, will put those big populations at risk. What is reassuring in Gower is that if the snail had been restricted to the transition zones, it's very much boxed in. Fortunately, it's obviously not only in the transition zone.
Yeah.
It's far more widespread and in quite good numbers in these dune slacks, and certainly at Whitford. And and again, it's not the end of the story. We need to go back and try and fill in some of the gaps. But it's very tight, it takes a lot of time. And one of the focuses, hopefully, this coming year, or this year, will be to go back to Whitford and look more carefully, and Oxwich, because we haven't been looking at the semi-fixed and fixed dunes. We're more or less ignoring them. It wasn't there. And then that population at Oxwich was just taken on chance. And yes, it was prolific there. Again, amazing, considering that was a fairly dry, well-drained site at the end of a record period of hot weather and drought.
Yeah.
Anyway.
June. Well, a whole series of things. One is that long-term detailed data is very difficult to come by because it usually is a length of 3 years as a PhD thesis, and they've got to do something different, haven't they? So, so this is a common thing throughout conservation. And then another thing which comes also broadly over conservation is the vast increase in the speed of tree growth, particularly with things like willows and also in other places sycamores, where they have very prolific seeding, and it seems to be tied up with climate change. And this is something which we're going to have to.
I think at Oxwich, I think there was grazing and they were cutting. and it was flagged up a long time ago that this is happening, and nobody's really seemed to have. And the fencing of the transition zone margin
Yes.
has not helped, because it's allowed that area to grow right up to the fence.
Yes.
Which is what I showed in the photograph. Yes, I mean it's amazing. If you didn't have that historic data and those historic photographs, and you went there now, you wouldn't realise that what looks like quite mature older woodland is really quite recent, actually.
Yes, and then of course sand dunes are a very dynamic habitat, aren't they? And that they're changing all the time, and you get blowouts in the dune system, and then the dune slats come and go, and possibly the self-fertility of these vertigos is their winning ticket, because you just need one blown in by the wind, and if it does by chance get into a good place, then it survives.
Yep, they know what they're about. Good strategy, isn't it?
Yes.
Not parthenogenesis, self-fertilization. Okay.
Something else as well in
Right.
the same self-fertility is violets,
Oh,
because
right.
violets produce cleistogamous flowers that they try sexual reproduction in April, and if there are not many insects around, the seed the seed set isn't particularly good, and then sometime later in the summer, around about July, August, up come some more flower buds, but they are non-opening flower buds. They don't waste their energy in producing petals to attract insects, but they've tried that and it hasn't worked. So they then go on to belt and braces, and they have these non-opening self-fertile flowers which are called cleistogamous, and they are the ones which produce the seeds. But of course you do get a clonal situation as arise from those, and it happens in violets and also in wood sorrels as well.
Right. Ben, can I prompt a person in the audience to make an observation? We had a yeah, you told me about it, and it relates to what Robert wrote in his book. So
yeah, you mentioned the idea that these little snails get blown around by the wind, and if you look in Robert, I think it's page 317 because I looked it up. He's got a good section on dispersal, and that includes reference to the famous wind tunnel experiment, where they put some small vertiginid snails into wind tunnels, and they calculated they could be blown for several kilometers very easily, as long as they started 100 meters up or so. But it was quite easy to find the reference, and it's in Robert's book, so I'm sure they are driven around by the wind.
Yeah, that was a good, because I mentioned this on the phone to you, and you point this out. I mean, I read Robert's book, and I hadn't sort of. There's such a lot of information there. You can't store all of it. My brain, but it is. I went back and checked, and this is something you mentioned in your New Naturalist.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very eccentric Francisco who did this experiment with the line.
That's it. Yeah,
which is very similar in size. Yeah. And he was trying to see how it might disperse to various Aegean islands. And of course, what nobody, I mean, also very recently, there have been a Czech team who have discovered that all sorts of snails can pass through the guts of small birds unkilled. Not all, so I think particularly those that can reasonably seal off the mouth. So clausiliids, for example, pass through very easily and survive. Oxychilus, not so much. Gets attacked by the digestive juices. But we simply do not have enough. It's very difficult. I mean, the experiment that we referred to, I mean, in a way, it's a bit of a joke, because, of course, one of the things that you should try is what happens when a vertigo, for example, is stuck to a little bit of leaf or debris. The surface area to weight ratio changes drastically, and it could be blown far further. You think of the way leaves are blown in the wind, and sometimes travel very considerable distances.
And many of the angustiors in the bulk samples are actually attached to little bits of sedge and other vegetation.
Yes.
So yeah, I agree. Are there any more questions?
Can we thank Martin again? I think for stimulating talk. I'm going to think it's sensible that we stop the Zoom part of this. The only thing left on the agenda is one or two